The night Richard Sterling threw his wife into a Manhattan snowstorm, fresh from throat surgery, voiceless, humiliated in front of their 14-year-old sons, he believed he had buried her for good. He was wrong, because the man who found her shivering on the curb was the one person Richard Sterling should have feared most in this city. And unlike Richard, Vincent Moreau never left anyone he cared about out in the cold. If you want to know how one woman rebuilt everything a powerful man tried to destroy, hit that like button, drop your city in the comments, and let me see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The snow had been falling since noon, and by 9 o'clock, it had swallowed the lower half of Manhattan whole. It came down in thick, silent curtains, the kind of snow that muffled sirens and turned yellow cabs into slow-moving ghosts, and made the entire city feel like it was being erased from the edges inward. On the 14th floor of the Ashford residence on West 72nd Street, the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Sterling penthouse had fogged at their corners from the heat inside, and from the outside, anyone looking up would have seen warm amber light behind frosted glass and thought, money lives there, comfort lives there, safety lives there. They would have been wrong about all three. Vivian Crawford Sterling stood in the center of the master bedroom with her back to the door and her hands pressed flat against the surface of the dresser, steadying herself. The mirror above it showed her a woman she barely recognized. The surgical tape at the base of her throat was still white, still clean. The procedure had been 2 days ago, a benign nodule removed from her vocal cords, the kind of thing the surgeon had called routine with the breezy confidence of a man who had never had to be afraid of his own silence. She had woken from the anesthesia alone. Richard had not come. She swallowed carefully the way the doctor had instructed, slow, deliberate, no strain, and felt the familiar low throb that reminded her the wound was still fresh. She could produce sound. The surgeon had confirmed that. A rasp, a whisper, a broken approximation of her normal voice that would need weeks to fully return. But for now, in the ways that would matter most tonight, she was mute. She had heard Richard come home 40 minutes ago, heard the elevator, heard the front door, heard the particular heaviness of his footsteps that told her he was not in a manageable mood. She had learned to read him by sound over the years the way a person learns to read weather. The specific cadence of his walk, the duration of silence between the door closing and his first spoken word, the pitch of how he said her name when he was about to make her regret something. She had been sitting with the boys in the living room when he walked in. Ethan and Landon, both 14, both already too good at going still when their father entered a room. They had learned it the way children learn everything dangerous, by necessity, incrementally, without anyone explaining to them that this was not how it was supposed to be. Richard had stood in the doorway in his overcoat, snow melting on his shoulders, briefcase in one hand and his phone in the other, and he had looked at Vivian with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not anger, not contempt, those she knew. This was something colder and more deliberate, like a door being closed and locked from the inside. He had said, "Boys, go to your room." Ethan had looked at his mother. Landon had not. Landon had already begun moving. That had been 40 minutes ago. Since then, Vivian had heard Richard on the phone in his office, one conversation, then another. And she had heard enough fragments through the walls to understand that something had shifted. The words federal and audit and documentation had come through clearly. The name Marcus Hale, Richard's attorney, had come through twice. And then a longer silence, followed by the sound of Richard's office door opening and his footsteps coming toward the bedroom with the kind of unhurried confidence that was somehow more frightening than urgency. He opened the bedroom door without knocking. He was still in his coat. He hadn't even loosened his tie. He stood in the doorway looking at her in the mirror's reflection, and Vivian turned around slowly because she would not face whatever this was with her back to it. Richard Sterling was 51 years old and looked 10 years younger in the way that certain wealthy men managed, the kind of youth bought through trainers and tailoring and the preserved vitality of a man who had never had to do physical work in his life. He was broad-shouldered and square-jawed with silver threading through dark hair at his temples, and he had the eyes of someone who had decided a long time ago that other people were resources rather than individuals. Vivian had once mistaken those eyes for confidence. It had taken her years to understand the difference. He said, "I need you to understand something before I explain what's going to happen." Her throat ached. She said nothing because nothing she could have produced would have counted as a response anyway. The account structures, he said. The Crawford Sterling Holdings subsidiaries. The shell filings under your name in Delaware and Nevada. He paused. The offshore routing through the Cayman accounts that list you as the controlling beneficial owner. She felt the floor do something strange beneath her. Those were set up using your documentation, he said. Your signature, your identity, and there is now a federal subpoena in motion that is going to surface all of it within the next 6 weeks. He tilted his head slightly, the way he did when he was delivering a conclusion he had already rehearsed. The exposure is going to land on whoever's name is attached to those structures. That's you, Vivian. She opened her mouth, closed it. Her vocal cords produced something small and damaged that was not quite a word. I didn't ask you to speak, Richard said. I'm telling you what is. Marcus has reviewed everything. The paper trail as it stands points to a woman who used her financial credentials and her professional access to construct a laundering network across 14 real estate transactions spanning 6 years. He paused. That woman has your name, your social security number, your electronic signature on approximately 340 documents. The room was very quiet. Vivian's hands found the edge of the dresser again. I'm filing for divorce tonight, Richard said. The papers are already prepared. You'll be served in the morning. This apartment, is held under a trust structure that does not include you. Marcus has confirmed that your residency claim is non-viable. He said the last word like it was a technical term rather than the destruction of a life. You'll need to make arrangements. She stared at him. 14 years. The boys asleep in the next room at the end of the hall, the surgical tape on her throat, the snow pressing silently against the glass. She found enough voice to force one word out, and it came out cracked and barely audible. Why? Richard looked at her for a moment with something that might, in another man, have been regret. In him, it was simply the brief acknowledgement of a complication being resolved. Because when they come looking, he said, I need someone to have already been removed from my life. Someone whose fingerprints are already on everything they're going to find. He straightened his coat. You were very good at your job, Vivian. That's why your name is on all of it. She thought she might be sick. The nausea moved through her in a slow, cold wave, and she pressed both hands harder against the dresser and breathed through it the way the surgeon had told her to breathe. Carefully, steadily, no sudden strain on the healing tissue. She had known, in the abstract way that a person knows something they have spent years refusing to look at directly, that Richard's business was not entirely clean. She was a financial analyst. She had spent her career reading structures and identifying anomalies, and the structures around Richard's real estate empire had never been transparent to her in the way that legitimate enterprise usually was. She had told herself it was compartmentalization, professional discretion, the appropriate separation of a husband's business from a wife's professional knowledge. She had told herself a lot of things, but she had not known her name was on it. She had not known that for years, while she sat across from clients and advised them on portfolio integrity and regulatory compliance, her own identity had been the mechanism through which her husband laundered money he had made through means she had chosen not to examine too closely. She thought about Ethan and Landon. She moved toward the door. Richard stepped aside, not out of courtesy, out of completion. He had said what he came to say. The rest was administrative. Vivian walked down the hallway to the boys' room and opened the door quietly. They were not asleep. Of course they were not asleep. Ethan was sitting on the edge of his bed with his elbows on his knees, and Landon was at the desk pretending to look at something on his laptop, and both of them looked up at her with the careful eyes of children who had heard enough to understand they needed to be braced. She could not explain it to them. She could not form the sentences required. She opened her mouth and what came out was barely sound at all, a fractured whisper that didn't even manage to become a word. And she saw Ethan's face shift from braced to something younger and more frightened, and she hated Richard Sterling in that moment with a clarity and purity that she had never felt about anything in her life. She held up one hand. Wait. She pointed at their coats on the back of the door. Landon stood up immediately. He was the more practical of the two, always had been, and he moved with the quiet efficiency of a boy who had decided that being useful was the best available response to a situation he didn't understand. He pulled his coat from the hook and handed Ethan his. Ethan said, Mom, what is... She shook her head once, firmly, and pointed at the coats again, and something in her expression made him stop. They were dressed in 4 minutes. Vivian pulled on her own coat over the clothes she'd been wearing all day. She had nothing packed. There had been no time to pack. There was no version of tonight she had seen coming with enough clarity to prepare for. And she picked up the small bag she kept by the bed with her wallet and phone and medication and the follow-up instructions from the surgical center that she still hadn't fully read. She took both boys by their coat sleeves and walked them toward the front door. Richard was in the living room, phone to his ear, and he watched them cross the foyer without expression. Vivian did not look at him. She put her hand on the door, from behind her. "Vivian." She stopped. She did not turn. "The building's security has been instructed," Richard said. "Don't come back to this floor without prior authorization from my office." She opened the door and walked her sons into the elevator. In the lobby, the night concierge, a man named Gerald who had known the boys since they were 10, looked up from his desk and then looked quickly back down when he saw her face, and she understood that he already knew. Richard had called ahead. Of course he had. Richard prepared everything. She pushed through the glass doors and the cold hit her like a wall. The snow was still falling. It had not let up at all. If anything, it had intensified in the last hour, the flakes larger now and coming down faster, accumulating on the awning above the entrance and piling against the curb and muffling the sounds of the street into something almost peaceful. If you were the kind of person who could experience this moment as peaceful, which Vivian Crawford Sterling absolutely was not, Ethan came to stand beside her. He was as tall as she was now. She noticed that with a kind of numb irrelevance. When had that happened? And she felt his hand find her arm, not grabbing, just present, the way a person offers themselves as a steadying point. Landon said very quietly, "Where are we going?" She did not know. She pressed her lips together and breathed through her nose and tried to think. Her sister was in Boston. Her parents were gone. Her mother 4 years ago. Her father 6 months after. Her colleagues were colleagues, not friends, because Richard had spent years gently, systematically isolating her from anyone whose loyalty might have run in her direction rather than his. She had a phone with the limited number of contacts she trusted, and almost no cash because their finances had been consolidated years ago into structures she now understood were not actually hers. She tried to think of a hotel. She tried to think of a credit card that was in her name alone. She tried to think past the cold and the surgical ache in her throat and the particular quality of her 14-year-old son's voice when he said, "Where are we going?" She was still standing there, one hand on Ethan's sleeve, the other pressed against the wall of the building that no longer had a place for her, when the black Cadillac pulled to the curb. It moved with the kind of unhurried authority that came from a vehicle that knew it would not be honked at. Long, armored, matte black without a single chrome accent. The kind of car that existed in the city only in certain specific contexts, none of them casual. 2 men in dark coats stepped out of the front simultaneously. Neither of them was the kind of man you looked at directly for very long. The rear door opened. The man who stepped out was not what the car suggested, or rather how he was exactly what the car suggested, but not in the way a person might assume from the outside. Vincent Moreau was 53 years old, lean and straight-shouldered, with the deliberate stillness of a man who had learned long ago that stillness was its own form of power. He wore a dark overcoat, no hat, his dark hair silvered at the temples more thoroughly than she remembered, his face carrying the kind of weathering that wasn't age exactly, but rather the visible evidence of years spent making decisions that had weight. She had not seen him in 11 years. He stood on the sidewalk in the snow and looked at her, and his face did a thing she had not expected. It did not become the mask she had assumed time would have finished constructing. It opened, briefly, into something like pain. He said, "Vivian." Her voice would not answer him. She stood there with the snow coming down and the cold working through her coat, and both her sons staring at this man they had never met, and she could not produce a single word. Vincent looked at her throat, at the surgical tape, back at her face. Something moved behind his eyes and then was contained. He looked at the boys. He took them in with the quick, complete assessment of a man who spent his professional existence reading rooms, their ages, their coats, the absence of luggage, the way Ethan was holding his mother's arm, and Landon was standing half a step back with his hands in his pockets and his jaw set against whatever this was going to turn out to be. Vincent looked back at Vivian. "Come with me," he said. His voice was low and unhurried. "No one will leave you in the cold again." She should have asked questions. She should have been cautious. She should have processed the implications of stepping into a car belonging to a man whose name appeared in the kind of conversations that happened in federal buildings. But she was standing in 9 degrees Fahrenheit, with her sons beside her, and her throat cut open and no money and nowhere to go. And Vincent Moreau was the only person on this street who had looked at her and seen a person rather than a liability. She moved toward the car. Ethan's hand tightened on her arm briefly, not pulling her back, just registering the moment. And then he walked with her. Landon fell into step on her other side without a word. Vincent held the door. He did not touch her. He simply held the door and let her choose to walk through it. And that small, specific restraint was the thing that cracked something loose in her chest that she could not afford to examine right now. The inside of the car was warm and dark and silent. A partition separated the rear compartment from the driver. There were 3 seats across. She took the middle one without thinking, both boys settling on either side of her, which was how they had always arranged themselves when they were small and frightened and needed to reduce the available distance between themselves and their mother. She had not known they still did that. Vincent got in and pulled the door shut, and the Manhattan blizzard disappeared behind tinted glass. For a while, no one said anything. Then Ethan said, "Who are you?" Vincent looked at him. The question was direct and deliberate in the way that Ethan's questions always were. He had his mother's precision and none of his father's learned evasiveness. "Someone who knew your mother a long time ago," Vincent said. "How long ago?" "Before you were born." Ethan looked at him for a moment with the careful, measuring eyes that had always made him seem older than his years. Then he looked at his mother as if waiting to see whether she would contradict any part of this. She didn't. She was looking at her hands in her lap. Landon had not asked anything. He was watching the city slide past outside the window, the snow-buried streets, the headlights of cars ghosting through white, the apartment buildings giving way to larger structures as they moved uptown. He was cataloging it the way Landon always cataloged everything, filing it away into whatever internal architecture he used to make sense of a world that had stopped making sense to him a long time ago. The car moved north through Central Park West and then turned, and when they stopped, Vivian looked up and saw a building she recognized, not personally but by reputation. Glass and dark steel, 60 stories or close to it, with a lobby visible through the ground floor windows that had the particular kind of emptiness that came from being maintained by staff rather than inhabited by residents who used common spaces. The elevator that took them up was private. It opened directly into an entrance foyer the size of some people's apartments, floored in pale stone and lit by recessed lighting that produced warmth without visible source. A woman in her 50s with close-cropped gray hair and the bearing of someone who had been managing complicated situations for decades was already there when the doors opened, and she looked at Vivian and the boys with efficient, unsurprised attention. "Dr. Reyes will arrive in 20 minutes, she said to Vincent, then to Vivian in a softer register. "There are rooms prepared. If either of the boys needs anything." "They need food," Landon said flatly. "We haven't eaten since lunch." The woman looked at him. The ghost of something approving moved across her face. "I'll have it brought up," she said. "What do they like?" "Anything," Ethan said. "We're not picky." "Burgers," Landon said at the same time, with the particular precision of a boy who had decided that if someone was offering, you might as well be specific. The woman, whose name, Vivian would learn later, was Eleanor Marsh, and who had been managing Vincent's household for 18 years, nodded once and turned to lead them further inside. Vivian stood in the foyer for a moment after the others moved. Vincent had not followed them yet. He stood a few feet away with his hands in the pockets of his overcoat, and he was looking at her with an expression that had the quality of someone who had prepared several versions of a conversation and was now setting all of them aside in favor of something more honest. She pressed her fingers to her throat, found enough voice to produce a rough whisper. "You didn't follow me." He understood immediately, 11 years ago, when it ended. "No," he said, "I didn't." "Why are you helping us now?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, somewhere far below, the city continued its muffled, snow-buried night. Up here, the silence was the expensive kind, complete, deliberate, the silence of a place where nothing happened that wasn't chosen. "Because Richard Sterling just threw you into a blizzard," Vincent said, "and I happened to be on that street." She looked at him. "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed, "it isn't." She held his gaze for another moment, and then the rasp in her throat made itself known again, and she looked away because she did not have the energy for the conversation that lived underneath this one. Not tonight. Tonight she needed to get her sons fed and figure out where she stood legally and try to understand the dimensions of what Richard had done to her. The rest would have to wait. She followed Eleanor down the corridor toward the sound of Landon explaining to someone on the kitchen staff exactly how he wanted his burger cooked, and she thought distantly that at least one of her children was going to be all right. Dr. Reyes arrived in 19 minutes. A compact woman in her early 40s with a medical bag and the calm, no-context efficiency of someone accustomed to being called to places she was not meant to ask questions about. She examined Vivian's throat with a small light and careful hands and confirmed that the surgical site was intact. No complications from the cold exposure, no stress damage to the healing tissue. She left a prescription, a set of instructions more detailed than the surgical centers, and a number to call if anything changed. When she was gone, Eleanor showed Vivian to a room at the end of the east corridor, large, simply furnished, with a view of Central Park blanketed in white below. The boys' rooms were adjacent. Ethan's door was already closed. Through Landon's, she could hear the quiet, specific sound of him doing something methodical, probably unpacking the small backpack he'd grabbed, organizing whatever he'd had the foresight to bring into whatever order would make him feel like he had some control over his situation. She sat on the edge of the bed and held her phone and thought about what to do next. Her sister. She needed to call her sister. And a lawyer, she needed a lawyer who was not connected to Richard in any way, which meant not anyone she had been introduced to through Richard, which eliminated most of the legal contacts she had. She needed to understand what documents she had access to. She needed to understand exactly which accounts had her name on them, and which of those had been used for the things Richard had described. She needed to understand whether she was already a target of the federal investigation he had mentioned or simply a pending one. She opened her contacts and stared at them. Vincent knocked on the open door. She looked up. He had removed his coat. He was carrying 2 cups of something, tea, it turned out, plain and hot, and he held one out to her without commentary. She took it because she was cold even inside now, cold in the deep way that had more to do with shock than temperature. He did not sit. He stood near the door with his own cup and looked out the window at the snow-covered park below. "He set you up," Vincent said. It was not a question. She produced a careful exhale, nodded. "Your signature on the shell structures." She looked at him sharply. "I know what Richard Sterling's empire looks like," Vincent said simply. "I've been watching it for 2 years." He looked at her. "I didn't know your name was on any of it until tonight. If I had—" He stopped. Considered. It wouldn't have changed what happened 11 years ago, but it would have changed what happened 2 years ago when I started watching him. She stared at him. "You've been investigating Richard." "Watching," he said. "Not the same thing." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. When Vincent Moreau was quiet, she remembered it was not because he didn't have an answer. It was because he was deciding how much of the truth the moment required. "Because Richard Sterling has been doing business with people who do business with me," he said. "And the kind of business he conducts tends to become a liability for everyone adjacent to it." He looked at his cup. "He's sloppy. Always has been. Talented at appearing legitimate, less talented at actually being it." He said there's a federal subpoena. "There will be," Vincent said. "Within 6 weeks was generous. I'd estimate 4. She held the cup in both hands. The warmth was helping. "He's going to try to make me the responsible party." "Yes." "He forged my signature." "I know." "Can you prove that?" Vincent looked at her then, and his expression had the quality of a man who had just had a conversation's worth of subtext made unnecessary. "Vivian, I have documentation on Richard Sterling's financial structures going back 18 months. I have communications. I have records of every transaction that moved through the shells he constructed under your name. I have the originating documents." He paused. "What I have is a case for your innocence. What I don't have yet is someone with the financial expertise to help me build it into something a federal prosecutor would take seriously." She understood what he was saying. She looked at him steadily. "You're offering me a job," she said. "I'm offering you a way to take your life back," he said. "The job comes with it." She was quiet for a long time. Through the wall, she could hear Ethan moving around in his room, the specific sound of him pacing, which was what he did when he was thinking through something he couldn't resolve. She thought about what she would say to them tomorrow. She thought about 14 years of a marriage that had been, she now understood, a structure built around her usefulness rather than her presence. She thought about Richard's face in the bedroom doorway, the complete absence of anything that resembled difficulty in what he was doing. She thought about Vincent standing in the snow, holding a car door open, saying, "Come with me." "I need a lawyer first," she said. "Elena Vasquez," Vincent said immediately. "She's the best federal defense attorney in New York who doesn't currently have any of Richard's money. I'll have her contact information sent to your phone in the morning. And I need access to my professional records, my own files. 11 years of documented financial work under my name that predates whatever Richard built on top of it. We'll get it. And my sons stay here only as long as they choose to." Of course. She looked at him. Something in her chest was doing something complicated, something that had been doing it since she saw him step out of that car on West 72nd Street, and her nervous system had recognized him before her mind caught up. The specific physical fact of Vincent Moreau that she had spent 11 years compressing into something she could walk around without it slowing her down. She said, "Why were you on that street tonight, Vincent?" He met her eyes. "Because," he said, "I drive past that building sometimes." The room was very quiet. She looked away first. She turned toward the window and the snow-buried park below and the lit silhouette of a city that had no idea any of this was happening, and she breathed carefully through her healing throat and tried to organize what was left of herself into something that could handle what came next. "Okay," she said. It was barely a whisper, but he heard it. "Okay," she said again. "Let's build the case." He said nothing. He simply set his cup on the table near the door and left her alone with the window and the city and the snow, which was still falling as if it had no intention of stopping, as if it could bury everything Richard had done and leave behind a city that looked clean. But Vivian Crawford had spent her career reading what was buried under clean surfaces. She picked up her phone and she started to work. It was past midnight when Ethan knocked on her door. He came in without waiting for an answer. He had always done that, had never learned to wait. And he sat in the chair by the window and looked at her with his father's jaw in her eyes, which was the particular cruelty of genetics in this situation. "Are we safe?" he said. She put her phone down. She looked at her son. "Yes," she said carefully. Her voice was worse now than it had been earlier, the day catching up with the damage. "For now." "That man," Ethan said. "Vincent, you knew him." "A long time ago." Ethan was quiet for a moment. He had his elbows on his knees and his hands loose between them, and he was doing the thing he did when he was about to say something he'd been building toward. "He's not a normal person," Ethan said. The way the other men moved around him, the apartment, the doctor showing up in 20 minutes at midnight. "No," Vivian agreed. "He's not a normal person." "What is he?" She thought about how to answer that. She thought about the 11 years she'd had to think about how to answer that, and the answer she had come to by the end of them, which was something more complicated and less comfortable than the surface question required. "He's someone who operates outside certain systems," she said carefully, "and inside others." Ethan looked at her for a long time, then, "He's going to help us." "Yes." "Why?" She said, "I'm not entirely sure yet." Ethan sat with that. He was good at sitting with incomplete information, better than his brother, better than his father had ever been. He had always had this quality of being able to hold a situation without needing it resolved immediately, and she loved him for it with an intensity that was almost painful. "Dad set you up," Ethan said. Not a question, more like a conclusion he had arrived at somewhere between dinner and midnight. She said nothing. "I heard enough," he said quietly. "Through the wall. I'm sorry, I wasn't trying to, but it's okay." "It's not." He looked at her steadily. "It's really, specifically, not okay." She almost smiled. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." He stood up. He was going to say something else. She could see him organizing it. And then he seemed to decide that it was too large for tonight and filed it back for later. He bent and kissed her forehead, which he had not done since he was about 9 years old, and then he went back to his room and closed the door. Vivian sat in the chair where he'd been sitting. She held her phone and her cup in her carefully assembled composure, and she stared out at the snow. In the morning, the city would still be buried. Richard's attorneys would still be moving. The federal investigation would still be advancing. All of it would still be exactly as catastrophically real as it was right now. But she had her boys. She had her files. She had 11 years of impeccable, documented professional work that predated every shell company Richard had built under her name. She had a federal defense attorney she hadn't called yet. She had a financial intelligence apparatus she hadn't agreed to join yet. And she had something that Richard had somehow failed to account for in all his careful preparation and his 14 years of using her. He had underestimated what she knew. Not about his structures, though she was beginning to understand she knew more about those than she'd allowed herself to admit. Not about his methods. About him. About the specific architecture of how Richard Sterling had built his empire and where he had cut corners and what he had prioritized and what he had ignored and why. Vivian Crawford had spent 11 years being the most competent person in every room she entered while allowing Richard to believe he was the most important. She understood. Sitting in a penthouse above Central Park while snow fell on a city that had tried to swallow her whole, that those were two very different things. Her phone lit up. An unknown number. She looked at the screen and then, after a moment, answered. "Miss Crawford?" A woman's voice, professional and unhurried. "My name is Elena Vasquez. I understand you may need counsel." Outside the window, 40 floors below, a single set of headlights moved slowly through the white buried park drive, the only car on the road, going somewhere with purpose. Vivian put the phone to her ear. "Tell me," she said, "how quickly we can establish that my signature was forged." And in the long silence before Elena Vasquez began to answer, Vivian heard something else through the wall. Landon's voice, low and urgent, talking to someone she couldn't identify. His laptop chiming with whatever he was pulling up at midnight in a stranger's penthouse in the middle of a blizzard. She would find out in the morning what her younger son had already started looking for. By then, it would be too late to stop him. And she wasn't sure she would have, even if she could. Us. Landon's laptop was open to a Delaware Secretary of State business entity search, and he had been at it for 2 hours. Vivian stood in the doorway of his room and watched him for a moment before he noticed her. He was sitting cross-legged on the bed with the laptop balanced on a pillow in front of him and 3 different browser tabs open and a yellow legal pad beside him covered in handwriting so small and dense it looked like circuitry. He had taken off his coat and shoes but was still in everything else, and the focused, slightly hunched posture of his concentration was so familiar, so specifically, heartbreakingly his, that she had to press her hand flat against the doorframe. He looked up. "Crawford Sterling Property Holdings, LLC, he said, without preamble. "Registered in Delaware 18 months ago. Registered agent is a company called Summit Filing Services. They're a formation agent. They register hundreds of shells for anyone who pays the fee. The listed member is Crawford Financial Consulting, Inc., which is registered in Nevada under your name and your social security number." He turned the legal pad toward her. "That one was registered 4 years ago. You were in Tokyo at a conference when it was filed." She crossed the room and sat on the edge of his bed and looked at what he had written. "I pulled your passport," he said. "Not your actual passport. The photocopy you keep in the safe in your office. I know the combination. I've known it since I was 11. A beat. You were in Tokyo, 4 days. The filing date is March 14th. You were at the Mandarin Oriental." She looked at her son. He was 14 years old, and he had just handed her the first piece of documentary evidence that she had been in a different country when her identity was used to create the vehicle that would later be used to launder money across 14 real estate transactions. "Landon," she said. "There are more," he said. "I found 6 entities so far. 2 in Delaware, 3 in Nevada, 1 in Wyoming. All of them list either you directly or a company in your name as the controlling member. I'm cross-referencing the filing dates against your calendar. I exported it from your iCloud backup." He looked at her steadily. 3 of the 6 have filing dates where your location is verifiable. The Wyoming one was filed the day Ethan had his appendix out. You were at Presbyterian the entire day. I remember because you didn't eat anything and I had to get food from the vending machine. She sat very still. I need your login for the iCloud backup, he said, to get the rest of the calendar history. Landon, Mom. His voice was flat and careful in the way it got when he had decided to be patient about something he found unreasonable. I know what Dad did. I'm not asking you to explain it to me. I'm asking for your iCloud password so I can finish building the alibi documentation before Elena Vasquez's team needs it. She stared at him. I heard you on the phone with her, he said. Through the wall. She gave him the password. He turned back to his laptop. His hands on the keyboard were steady in a way that she recognized. It was the stillness of someone who had converted their distress into a task, who had taken the vast and shapeless fact of their father's betrayal and reduced it to something with searchable parameters and verifiable dates. She understood that impulse completely. It was where she lived professionally. She had not known her son lived there too. She went back to her room and sat in the dark for a while. In the morning, the snow had stopped, but the city was buried under 18 inches of it, and the sky was white and featureless, and the park below looked like something that had been erased. Vivian had slept for 3 hours. Her throat felt like the inside of something that had been scraped. She dressed in the clothes from yesterday. She had nothing else, and followed the smell of coffee to the kitchen, where Eleanor Marsh was already at the counter, and Vincent was at the table with a phone to his ear and 3 folders open in front of him. He looked up when she came in. He said something brief and low into the phone and ended the call. Eleanor set a cup in front of her without being asked. Elena Vasquez wants to meet at 10, Vincent said. I can have a car ready. I'd rather take a cab. He looked at her. He did not argue. Fine. She sat down across from him. The folders on the table had the particular quality of documents that had been organized by someone who expected them to be examined, and she could see from where she sat that they contained financial records, account statements, transaction logs, what looked like correspondence. She looked at them and then at him. You've been building a file on Richard, she said, for 18 months. Show me. He turned the first folder toward her. She opened it. What she found inside was not what she expected. She had prepared herself for the kind of surveillance documentation she associated with Vincent's world, photographs, intercepted communications, the rough and inadmissible evidence of someone who operated outside legal channels. Instead, she found clean financial forensics. Transaction records cross-referenced with property transfer documents, LLC registration filings, bank records that bore the institutional letterhead of actual financial institutions. Nothing that looked like it had been obtained through a wiretap or a broken window. Where did you get this? She said. Financial intelligence team, Vincent said. Legal division. I have 7 people whose entire job is regulatory compliance and financial forensics for my investment company. I gave them Richard as a project. That's... She stopped. Looked at the documents again. This is admissible. Most of it. Vincent. This is the kind of documentation that takes federal investigators years to compile. I had 18 months and 7 very good analysts and a specific motivation. He picked up his coffee. What do you see? She was already reading. Her eyes moved through the transaction logs with the specific speed of someone who spent their professional life interpreting this kind of data. And what she saw in the first 3 pages made her set the coffee down. The shell structure was more sophisticated than Richard had implied. It wasn't simply her name on a few entities. It was a layered architecture, the Crawford Sterling shells at the top, feeding into a series of intermediate holding companies that Richard controlled through nominees, eventually routing through what appeared to be legitimate real estate acquisition vehicles. The laundering mechanism was the gap between the purchase price and the reported value in the intermediate transfers, a classic technique, but executed with a precision that suggested someone with real financial expertise had designed it, someone with her level of expertise. She said, He didn't just use my identity, he modeled the structure on my methodology. Vincent said, Yes, my published methodology. I wrote a paper 6 years ago on shell structure analysis, how fraudulent entities conceal beneficial ownership. It's in the Journal of Financial Forensics. She felt something cold move through her that was not the residual chill of last night. He built his laundering architecture using my own analytical framework, inverted, which means, Vincent said, that anyone who knows your work and looks at this structure will see your fingerprints all over the design logic, not just your name on the paperwork. She sat back. The implications of that organized themselves in her mind with terrible clarity. Richard had not simply used her as a signature on documents. He had constructed something that would, to a federal investigator familiar with her professional work, appear to have been designed by Vivian Crawford. It was not just identity theft, it was intellectual framing. He's been planning this for years, she said. At least 6, possibly from the beginning. She thought about 14 years of marriage. She thought about the deliberate, incremental way Richard had managed her professional life, the encouragement to publish, the support for her public profile, the way he had made her into an identifiable expert in exactly the field his scheme required. She thought about how proud she had been, how professionally visible, how thoroughly documented. She said, "I was the exit strategy from the moment we married." Vincent said nothing, which was its own answer. She closed the folder. Her hands were steady. She made them stay steady. "I need to meet with Elena Vasquez," she said. "Car's ready when you are." She stood up. She said without looking at him, "Did you know, when we were together, did you know what Richard Sterling was?" The kitchen was very quiet. "No," Vincent said. "I knew he was pursuing you. I knew he had money and connections and a legal business that moved faster than it should have. I didn't know the rest." A pause. "I also didn't fight for you. That's the part I knew then and know now." She picked up her coat from the back of the chair. "I'll be back by noon," she said. Elena Vasquez's office was on the 32nd floor of a building in Midtown that had the specific atmosphere of serious legal practice, not the polished marble performance of Richard's attorney's offices, but something quieter and more functional, the kind of place where people came when they needed results rather than aesthetics. Vasquez herself was in her mid-50s, compact and dark-haired, with the particular quality of attention that Vivian associated with the best analytical minds she had encountered in her career. She looked at Vivian across the table and she listened without interrupting for 22 minutes while Vivian laid out everything she knew. When Vivian finished, Vasquez said, "The alibi documentation your son compiled. He found 6 entities so far. 3 with filing dates he can document against my verifiable location. I need all of it, everything he has and everything he can find. The more filing dates we can place against documented locations, the faster we establish that the signatures were not only forged, but systematically forged across a multi-year period." Vasquez made a note. "That distinction matters. A single forged signature is a dispute. A pattern of forged signatures across 6 years with verifiable contradicting location evidence is a federal crime committed against you. Richard will argue I authorized the filings remotely. He'll try, and we'll pull the formation agent records, Summit Filing Services. They have physical processes, wet signatures for certain entity types. We'll pull every original document and run handwriting analysis." Vasquez looked up from her notes. "Ms. Crawford, I need to ask you something directly." "Go ahead." "Is there any document in Richard's structure that you actually signed? Any point at which you knowingly provided authorization for anything related to these entities, even informally, even verbally?" Vivian thought about it. She thought about it the way she thought about financial structures, carefully, from the outside in, looking for the thing that didn't fit. "No," she said. "I never signed anything I didn't understand. That was always my line." "And did Richard ever present you with anything related to these entities that you declined to sign?" She thought harder. And then something surfaced, small and easily dismissed, which was probably why she had dismissed it at the time. A document Richard had left on her desk 18 months ago. She had glanced at it, seen it was related to a Nevada property holding entity under a name she didn't recognize, and pushed it back across to him with a question she no longer remembered the exact phrasing of, and he had taken it back without comment. She described this to Vasquez. Vasquez wrote for a long time. "That," she said, "is evidence that you actively declined to authorize involvement in one of his entities, which suggests you had no knowledge of the others." She looked up. "It's also something Richard is going to deny ever happened." "I know." "Do you have any documentation of that interaction? Email, text, anything?" "No, it was in person, in our apartment." "Surveillance in the building?" "The penthouse floor has cameras in the elevator and the lobby, not in the individual units." Vasquez was already reaching for her phone. "I'm going to subpoena the building's camera system before Richard's attorneys think to do the same." She dialed. Stay here. Vivian sat in the conference room while Vasquez stepped out, and she looked at the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows and thought about the document on her desk. She had pushed it back. She had asked a question. Richard had taken it without answering, and she had let it go because letting Richard go without an answer on things that didn't directly concern her professional work had become, over the years, one of the accommodations of their marriage. She had not pushed because she had chosen not to know. That was the thing she would not be able to say out loud in a deposition. She had not known, but she had also not wanted to know, and those two things were not identical, and the difference between them was the difference between innocence and something more uncomfortable. Her phone buzzed. Vincent. Richard's attorneys filed this morning. Divorce papers and an injunction preventing you from accessing any accounts held jointly or in trust structures associated with Crawford Sterling Holdings. Check your email. She checked. It was there. The injunction notice, forwarded from a service address Richard's team had apparently registered for her without her knowledge. The paperwork was 12 pages and had been prepared with a thoroughness that told her it had been in progress for weeks, possibly longer. She was looking at it when her phone buzzed again. This time, it was Landon. Found 2 more entities. One filed while you were at Ethan's school, play 3 years ago. I have the program. You signed a check for the drama department that night. Dated. Mom. He did this at every opportunity where you had a documented reason to be somewhere else. She stared at her son's text message. He had done it deliberately. Not just used her absence, but selected her absences. School events, professional travel, medical appointments. The occasions that would generate documentation of her presence elsewhere. The occasions that would make the clearest alibi. Which meant Richard had known, for years, that she might need an alibi. Which meant he had planned not just for her to take the fall. He had planned for her to be able to prove her innocence, and had designed the forgeries in a way that would require that proof. Comprehensive, documentable proof that would take months to compile. Months during which a federal investigation could move at its own pace. He had built her a cage with a key inside it, and the key would take so long to find that by the time she used it, he would already be clear. Vasquez came back in. Building management has the footage, she said. I have a preservation order in place. She sat down and looked at Vivian. I also just got a call from a contact at the U.S. Attorney's Office. The subpoena your husband mentioned is real. It's been in preparation for 6 weeks, and Miss Crawford, she paused in a way that carried weight. Your name is on the preliminary target list. The room did not physically change. The light was the same. The temperature was the same. Vivian's breathing was the same because she controlled it, carefully, with the practice of someone who had learned that falling apart was a luxury she consistently could not afford. How preliminary, she said. Preliminary enough that we can still get ahead of it, but we need to move fast. Vasquez looked at her steadily. I need everything your son has found. I need it today. And I need you to come in as a voluntary cooperating witness before they come to you, because walking in is the difference between being a target and being an asset to their case. Vivian said, They'll want Richard's full structure. Yes. I don't have all of it, but someone does, Vasquez said. She looked at Vivian with an expression that was professionally neutral, but not entirely without implication. Someone has been building a financial intelligence file on Richard Sterling for 18 months. Someone with resources significant enough to compile admissible documentation that most federal agencies would need years to gather. Vivian said nothing. If that someone were to make their documentation available through appropriate channels, Vasquez said carefully, it would materially accelerate the case against Richard and significantly clarify your position on the target list. That someone has his own reasons for keeping his documentation private. I understand that, Vasquez said, but his documentation protects you, and I suspect... She looked at Vivian with the calm attention of a woman who had been reading between lines for 30 years. That protecting you may currently be a priority for him. Vivian took a breath. I'll talk to him. She was in the car on the way back uptown when her phone rang. Not a text. An actual call from a number she had never seen before, and something about the specificity of the unknown number made her answer it. Ms. Crawford. A man's voice, middle-aged, measured in the way of people accustomed to institutional authority. My name is Dennis Holt. I'm a senior investigator with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. She said, I'm going to need to end this call and have my attorney contact you. That's your right, Holt said. I'm not calling to question you. I'm calling as a courtesy, or as close to one as my position allows. A pause. Your husband's attorney contacted our office this morning. He indicated that you have been operating as the controlling beneficial owner of a series of shell entities used for money laundering and that Richard Sterling was unaware of these activities. The silence in the car was the kind that had texture. He also, Holt continued, provided what he characterized as documentation of your signature on the original formation documents for these entities and on certain transaction authorizations. She said, "My attorney will be in contact with your office within the hour." I expected as much. Another pause. Ms. Crawford, I'm telling you this not because it changes our investigation, but because, in my experience, people who find out this way sometimes make decisions in the next 24 hours that complicate their situation significantly. His voice was dry and entirely without performance. I would encourage you not to do that. I understand, she said. Good. He hung up. She lowered the phone. Outside the car window, the city moved past in its snow-covered aftermath. The plows working through the avenues, the sidewalks still deep, the brown slush beginning at the curb edges where foot traffic had turned the clean white into something less certain. Richard had already moved. He had not waited for the morning, had not waited to see what she would do. He had called his attorney, and his attorney had called the FBI. And he had handed them a version of the story in which Vivian Crawford was the architect of a 6-year financial crime and Richard Sterling was a deceived husband. He had made the first move. He had made it before she had finished her first cup of coffee in someone else's apartment. She called Vasquez and told her about the call. Vasquez was silent for exactly 4 seconds. Then, "Do not speak to anyone without me present. Not the FBI, not Richard, not Richard's attorneys, no one." A beat. He just moved from divorce to active cooperation against you. That changes our timeline. How much? We go to the U.S. attorney tomorrow. First thing. I'm calling tonight. A pause. And I need that documentation. Whatever your source has. I need it tonight, Vivian. She hung up and looked at the back of the driver's headrest. She called Vincent. He answered on the second ring. Richard already called the FBI, she said. He told them I was the operator. His attorney delivered what he called documentation of my signatures. Vincent was quiet. My lawyer needs your files, she said. Tonight. Whatever you have, however you obtained it, she needs it to establish the case before the U.S. attorney tomorrow morning. More silence. She could hear something in the background of wherever he was. Muffled voices, the specific acoustic texture of a large room. Vincent, she said. I know what turning those files over means for you. I know there are things in your organization that you've kept legally separated from your intelligence operation and that introducing any of it into a federal proceeding creates exposure for you. She stopped. I'm not asking you to walk into a fire. I'm asking, I know what you're asking, he said. Then tell me if you can do it. Another pause, longer this time. My legal team redacts anything that touches my personal business before those files go anywhere, he said. The financial forensics on Richard's structure are clean and producible. The sourcing on 2 of the document sets is going to require explanation that I'd rather not provide in a deposition. Can it be anonymized? Some of it. Then anonymize what you can and have the rest to Vasquez by 8 tonight. He said, This is going to complicate things between us, Vivian. Everything between us is already complicated, she said. That ship sailed 11 years ago. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Fair. 8 o'clock, she said. Please. She ended the call and put her phone in her coat pocket and looked out the window at the city. The car turned onto Central Park West and she could see the park to her right. The snow still clean and unmarked in the interior, the paths empty, the trees holding their white weight with the indifferent patience of things that had survived many winters and expected to survive many more. She thought about Richard in his office at whatever hotel he was staying in now, calling his attorney, making his moves, arranging his story. She thought about how well she knew the shape of his preparation, the thoroughness, the preemptive strikes, the way he always tried to control the timeline. She had spent 14 years watching that mind work from an adjacent room. She knew every pattern, every tell, every assumption he made about how other people would respond to pressure. He had assumed she would panic. He had assumed she would be voiceless and stranded and without allies, and without documentation, and that by the time she got her bearings, his version of events would already be on record with every relevant authority. He had assumed that because she had always been careful, she would be slow. He did not know about Landon and his laptop and the yellow legal pad. He did not know about Elena Vasquez. He did not know that Vincent Moreau's legal financial intelligence team had been building a case against him for 18 months, and that the documentation was clean and admissible and sitting in a folder that was going to be on a federal attorney's desk before Richard's attorney finished his second cup of coffee tomorrow morning. And he did not know. This was the thing that lived at the center of everything, that Vivian Crawford had spent 11 years becoming exactly the expert his scheme required, which meant she understood his architecture better than any investigator who came to it from the outside. She was not going to panic. She was going to dismantle him from the inside with his own materials, in the language he had stolen from her. The car stopped in front of Vincent's building. She got out. The cold hit her, but she was ready for it this time. She walked through the lobby and into the elevator and pressed the button for the top floor. And as the elevator rose, she took her phone out and opened Landon's last text. She typed back, "Send me everything, all of it, tonight." His response came in 11 seconds. "Already compiled, 47 pages. Want me to send it to your lawyer or to you first?" She almost smiled. "Lawyer," she typed. "Elena Vasquez. I'll send you her email." The elevator opened into the foyer. Vincent was there already, which meant he had come from somewhere inside the apartment and positioned himself here, which was the kind of thing Vincent did. Positioned himself at arrival points, controlled the geometry of encounters in a way that had always struck her as unconscious, but probably wasn't. He looked at her. "It's ready," he said. "My legal team finished the redactions an hour ago. I've been waiting to know whether to send it." She said, "Send it." He looked at her for a moment with something in his face that she would think about later. Something that had the quality of a man standing at a decision he had been approaching for a long time. Then he took his phone from his pocket and sent a message with 3 words. She heard the muffled sound from his phone that confirmed it had gone. They stood in the foyer of his penthouse, 40 floors above a snow-buried city, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then Ethan appeared from the direction of the kitchen, carrying what appeared to be a bowl of cereal, and stopped when he saw them. He looked at his mother, he looked at Vincent, he looked at the specific quality of the silence between them with the careful eyes of a boy who had his mother's mind and 14 years of practice reading rooms that contained his father. "Something changed," Ethan said. "Yes," Vivian said. "What?" She looked at her son. She thought about how to explain what had just happened. That a man who operated in the margins of the law had just handed over documentation that would accelerate a federal prosecution, and that the documentation existed because he had been watching her husband for 18 months, and that the reason he had been watching her husband was something neither of them had said out loud yet. She said, "We just made a move that Richard can't reverse." Ethan looked at Vincent. Vincent said, "Your mother is right." Ethan looked back at his mother. Something in his face settled. Not relief exactly, but the particular quality of a person who has been braced for a blow that has now been redirected. "Okay," he said. He went back to the kitchen with his cereal. Vivian looked at Vincent. "When Richard finds out you've entered the picture officially," she said, "he's going to stop thinking about federal investigators and start thinking about you." "I know. He has people." "I know that too." "Vincent, Vivian." His voice was quiet and entirely without performance. "I have been in this city for 30 years. I have survived things that Richard Sterling cannot imagine. His people are accountants with guns." The faintest edge of something that might have been dry humor moved through his voice and then was gone. "I am not concerned about Richard Sterling's people." She held his gaze. "I'm concerned about mine," he said. And something in the way he said it, the slight heaviness, the quality of a man acknowledging a weight, told her that turning over those files had cost him something she didn't fully understand yet. She said, "What did you have to redact?" He looked at her for a long time. "Things," he said carefully, "that I would rather you didn't know. Not because I'm ashamed of them, because knowing them changes what you can say under oath." She understood. She had spent her career understanding exactly where the line between knowledge and culpability ran. She said, "Thank you." He said, Don't thank me yet. And in the morning, when Elena Vasquez called to say the U.S. Attorney's Office had agreed to a meeting and that the redacted documentation from Vincent's team had been received and was being reviewed by a federal forensic accountant who had apparently said, upon opening the first folder, that this was the cleanest private financial intelligence work she had seen outside a government agency. In that moment, Vivian would understand that the thing Richard had spent 14 years building was beginning, quietly and irreversibly, to come apart. But that was morning. Tonight, through the wall of the apartment, Landon was still typing. His light was still on at midnight, at 1, at 2. She checked once through the barely open door and saw him at the desk with the laptop and the legal pad, cross-referencing dates with the focused, relentless attention of a 14-year-old boy who had decided that the most useful thing he could do with his rage was turn it into evidence. She watched him for a moment. Then she went back to her room and sat at the small desk by the window and opened her laptop and began to write the document that Elena Vasquez had asked for. A detailed professional analysis of the shell structure Richard had built using her methodology, annotated with every deviation from legitimate practice and every point at which her actual methodology had been inverted to conceal rather than reveal. She wrote for 4 hours. She did not stop until the sky outside began to go pale at its edges. And by then she had 31 pages that constituted, in effect, a dismantling of her own stolen name. And somewhere across the city, in whatever room Richard Sterling had arranged for himself after throwing his family into the snow, he did not yet know that the woman he had spent 14 years carefully positioning as his exit strategy had spent the night building the architecture of his end. He would find out soon, and when he did, it would already be too late to... It was Richard who found out first. Not about the files, but not specifically, not yet. What reached him first was the name, Vincent Moreau. Someone inside the U.S. Attorney's Office had a phone, and someone with that phone had a relationship with one of Richard's people. And by 7:30 in the morning, while Vivian was still writing at the desk by the window and Landon's light was finally off, and Elena Vasquez was 3 cups of coffee into her preparation for the 10 o'clock meeting, Richard Sterling was sitting in the living room of a suite at the Four Seasons on East 57th Street with his overcoat still on and his attorney across from him and his phone face down on the table between them. Marcus Hale was 60 years old and had the particular dryness of a man who had spent 4 decades watching wealthy people destroy themselves in interesting ways. He sat with his ankles crossed and his legal pad on his knee, and he looked at Richard with the patient attention of someone delivering a weather forecast for weather that had already arrived. "The documentation submitted to the U.S. Attorney's Office this morning," Marcus said, "originated with a financial intelligence operation run out of Moreau Capital's legal division." Richard said nothing. 18 months of forensic work, Marcus continued. Clean, admissible. Cross-referenced against bank records, transfer documents, and entity filings going back 6 years. He looked at his legal pad. Whoever they had doing this work knew exactly what they were looking for and exactly how to document it for federal purposes. Richard picked up his phone, put it back down. "Vincent Moreau," he said. "Yes." "She went to Vincent Moreau." Marcus said carefully, "It appears he found her." The distinction seemed to land on Richard in a specific way. Something moved through his face. Not fear, not yet, but the preliminary reorganization of a man who has just discovered that the geography of his situation is different from what he mapped. He stood up. He walked to the window. Outside, the city was fully awake now in its post-blizzard state, the streets plowed and sanded, the morning light flat and gray off the snow. "He's been building a file on me for 18 months, Richard said. "That's what the documentation suggests." "Why?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. "I think," he said, "that's the wrong question. The more relevant question is what that file contains and whether we can challenge the sourcing in a suppression motion." Richard turned from the window. "Can we?" "Some of it. The document provenance on 3 of the transaction records is going to be difficult to establish through legitimate channels. If we can demonstrate that Moreau's team obtained those records through means that... How long would that take?" "A suppression motion, briefed and argued, 4 to 6 months, assuming the judge moves quickly." "And the federal timeline?" Marcus looked at him. "The indictment could come in 60 days. Richard stood very still. "I need something on Moreau," he said. I need something that makes him a liability to this proceeding. Something that makes the U.S. Attorney's Office think twice about whose files they're relying on. Marcus said, Richard, he is not clean, Marcus. No one who operates the way Vincent Moreau operates is clean. There are things he's done, organizations he's connected to, structures he maintains. Find them. Find something the U.S. Attorney can't ignore. What you're describing, Marcus said carefully, is using information obtained through channels that I don't care about channels. Richard's voice had gone flat in the way it went when he had passed through anger into something colder. I care about outcomes. Find something on Moreau and find it fast. Marcus looked at his legal pad. He wrote something. He did not say whether it was a note about the task or a note about the conversation, and Richard did not ask. The meeting with the U.S. Attorney's Office happened at 10 o'clock in a conference room on the 9th floor of a building on St. Andrews Plaza that smelled of recycled air and old coffee and the specific institutional gravity of a place where people's futures were regularly determined. Elena Vasquez sat on Vivian's left. A paralegal from Vasquez's office sat on her right. Across the table were two assistant U.S. attorneys, a man named Garrett, who was in his late 30s and had the focused, slightly aggressive energy of someone who competed at things, and a woman named Park, who was quieter and more careful, and who Vivian suspected was the sharper of the two. They had been in the room for 11 minutes before Garrett slid a photograph across the table. Vivian looked at it. It was a document, a transfer authorization for a transaction she didn't recognize, a movement of $4.2 million through a Crawford Sterling subsidiary to an intermediate account. The authorization bore her signature. She said, "That's forged." "We understand that's your position," Garrett said. "It's not a position. The signature is forged." She looked at it more carefully. The forgery was good, better than she had expected. Richard had used someone skilled or had taken the time to practice. The letter form was close. The pressure pattern was close. But there was something in the terminal stroke of the C in Crawford that was wrong in a way she could identify because she had been signing her own name for 40 years. She said, "The terminal stroke on the C drops left. Mine lifts right. Every signature I've ever produced in a professional context lifts right on the terminal stroke of the C. It is a consistent, documented characteristic of my signature that appears in every document I have signed over my entire career." She looked at Garrett. "Pull any contract, any professional engagement letter, any client document I've signed in the last 15 years and compare the terminal stroke. Every single one will lift right." Park was writing. Garrett said, "We have 14 documents bearing your signature across 6 years of transactions. Then you have 14 forgeries. Ms. Crawford, each of which was executed while I was verifiably elsewhere." Vasquez slid a folder across the table. 47 pages of alibi documentation, filing dates cross-referenced with passport records, hotel receipts, school event programs, medical records, and calendar data recovered from iCloud backup. 3 of the filing dates correspond to events at which my client's presence is documented by third-party institutional records. She paused. "One of the entities was filed while my client was in this building's lobby. Ms. Crawford had met with an SEC contact here. Sign-in records are included." The room went very quiet. Park looked at the folder. She opened it. She began to read. Garrett looked at Vivian. "Who compiled this documentation?" Vivian said, "My son." Something shifted in Garrett's expression. Not softening, he was not the type, but an involuntary recalibration. "Your son. My 14-year-old son." In a single night. Using publicly available entity search databases, my iCloud calendar backup, and documents that were already in our possession. She held Garrett's gaze. "If a 14-year-old can build this in one night, imagine what your forensic team will find when they have full subpoena access to the formation agent records." Park closed the folder. She looked at her colleague. Something passed between them that was not visible in their faces, but was entirely visible in the quality of the silence. Then Park said, "Ms. Crawford, we'd like to talk to you about what you know about Richard Sterling's transaction structure, specifically the intermediate entities between the Crawford Sterling shells and the final acquisition vehicles." Vasquez said, My client is prepared to cooperate as a material witness. We'd like to start now if possible. Vasquez looked at Vivian. Vivian nodded, and so she began to talk. She talked for 2 hours and 40 minutes. She talked the way she did when she presented to clients, precisely, linearly, with the specific vocabulary of someone who understood the material at a structural level rather than a descriptive one. She mapped Richard's architecture from the outside in, starting with the public-facing entities and working down through the intermediate layers to the beneficial ownership structures, explaining the inverted application of her own methodology, identifying the points at which the design logic diverged from legitimate practice, and what those divergences revealed about the intent, Park wrote continuously. Garrett asked questions that were, she noted, increasingly specific in ways that suggested he was cross-referencing against information he already had. At 12:40, Garrett said, the documentation provided by Moreau Capital's legal division. Vasquez said, that documentation was provided by a third party who had independent concerns about Richard Sterling's financial practices and chose to submit relevant findings through appropriate legal channels. We'd like to speak with a representative of that legal division. I'll convey the request. We'd like to speak with Vincent Moreau directly. Vasquez said, I'll convey that request as well. The meeting ended at 1:15. In the elevator, Vasquez said nothing until the doors closed. Then, that went better than I expected. Vivian said, Park already knew most of it. Yes. They've been building their own case. For at least 8 months, I'd estimate. What we gave them this morning accelerated their timeline significantly. Vasquez looked at the elevator doors. They're going to move on Richard within the next 3 weeks. Vivian absorbed this. He'll know we were there today. He'll know within the hour. He has someone. Vasquez said it without surprise or judgment, the way a person describes weather, which means we need to be prepared for him to escalate. What does escalation look like for Richard? Vasquez looked at her. It looks like whatever he does when he's cornered and out of legitimate options. She paused. Do you know what that looks like? Vivian thought about 14 years. She thought about the specific quality of Richard's stillness when he had decided on a course of action. She thought about the document on her desk 18 months ago that he had taken back without answering her question. Yes, she said, I know what it looks like. She was back at the penthouse by 2 o'clock and Vincent was not there. Eleanor said he had gone to his downtown offices and would return by 6. Vivian sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and began reviewing the documents Vasquez had sent over, the next steps, the required affidavits, the list of additional records the U.S. Attorney's team had requested. Ethan appeared and sat across from her. He had his own laptop. He had been doing something with it all morning, and she had not asked what because she had not had the bandwidth, and also because with Ethan, as with Landon, she had learned to trust the process before needing to understand it. He turned his laptop to face her. I've been going through the financial records Vincent's team compiled, he said. She looked at the screen. How did you get access to those? Landon, Ethan said simply. As if this explained everything. As if the fact that Landon could find or access anything given sufficient motivation was a settled law of their household. She looked at the screen. Ethan had pulled up a set of transaction records and annotated them. Actual annotations, typed and formatted, with the specific clarity of someone who understood what he was looking at. These 4 transactions, he said, pointing, they don't fit the pattern of the rest of the structure. The others all route through the Crawford Sterling shells, and then down through the intermediate layer. These 4 go sideways. He traced the path on the screen. They route out of the intermediate layer into a separate holding structure, one that doesn't have your name on it at all. Vivian leaned forward. She looked at the 4 transactions. She looked at the destination entity, a holding company called Meridian Property Trust, registered in the Cayman Islands, with a nominee director and no visible beneficial owner in the public filings. She said, Did you identify the beneficial owner? Ethan looked at her. He was 14 years old, and he had the specific expression of someone delivering information they wished they did not have. I can't get to it through public records, he said. The Cayman structure is opaque, but I can see the pattern of what gets routed there. It's the cleanest money. The transactions that have the least paper trail in the intermediate layer. Whatever Meridian is, it's where the money goes when it needs to disappear most completely. She straightened. Someone helped Richard build that structure, she said. Not to Ethan, to herself, working it through. The Cayman layer is a different level of sophistication from the domestic shells. Someone with offshore structuring experience set that up. She thought about the architecture she had spent 2 hours describing to the U.S. Attorney's team. She thought about what she had not included because she had not known about it. I didn't see this when I was going through Vincent's files. Because it's not in Vincent's files, Ethan said. I found it in the raw transaction data that Landon pulled from the Delaware filing system. It's a reference, a pass-through notation in one of the intermediate entity records that points to Meridian as a receiving account. Whoever set up the domestic layer wasn't trying to hide this connection. They assumed no one would look at the raw notation data. She looked at her son. They assumed wrong, she said. Yeah, Ethan said. He did not look pleased about it. He looked like someone who had found something that made a situation more complicated than it already was. She picked up her phone and called Vasquez. Vasquez listened. She was quiet for a moment, then, "Send me everything he found, right now." What does it mean for the case? It means Richard's structure is more complex than what we presented this morning, which means our presentation this morning was incomplete. A pause. Which is fine. We didn't misrepresent anything. We simply didn't have this yet. But it also means there's a layer of Richard's operation that neither we nor apparently Vincent's team identified, which means someone helped him build it who has not yet appeared in this investigation. Vivian said, "A partner, or a handler." Vasquez's voice had gone carefully neutral in the way it did when she was thinking something she wasn't ready to say. "Send me the files. Don't discuss this with anyone else until I've reviewed them." She ended the call. She looked at Ethan. She said, "You did good." He looked uncomfortable. "I don't feel like I did good. I feel like I found something that made everything worse." "That's what good looks like," she said. "When the thing you find makes everything more complicated. Simple answers don't solve complex crimes." He thought about that. He didn't look convinced, but he nodded and closed his laptop and went to find his brother. Vincent came back at 5:40, not 6. He came in through the private elevator and went directly to the kitchen and started making coffee in the way of someone who needed something to do with his hands. And Vivian watched him from the doorway and understood that something had happened. She said, "What?" He did not turn around. "Richard called someone. Marcus Hale called someone. He's looking for information on you to submit to the U.S. Attorney's Office." She had expected this. "I know. Vasquez is monitoring it." "Not Hale." Vincent turned. His face had the quality she associated with his worst moments. Not anger, but the complete settled stillness that came after anger had been converted into something more useful. "Richard called someone directly. Someone who has been quiet for 18 months since I started looking at him. Someone who apparently decided that 18 months of quiet was sufficient waiting and that it was time to become a problem again." She looked at him. "Who?" she said. Vincent picked up his coffee. He looked at it. He set it back down. "A man named Carver," he said. "Thomas Carver. He runs a financial structuring operation out of London with branches in Cayman and Singapore." He looked at her. "He's also the reason I started watching Richard in the first place." She felt something shift in her chest. Richard has a connection to Carver. Richard has been running money for Carver for 6 years. The Meridian Property Trust. He stopped, looked at her. "You already know about Meridian." Ethan found it 2 hours ago. Something moved through Vincent's expression. Of course he did. A pause that had weight in it. Meridian is Carver's structure. Richard is one of several operators who route money into it. The domestic shells, the Crawford Sterling layer, your name on the intermediate entities. That entire architecture exists to clean money that originates with Carver's organization before it reaches Meridian. She stood very still. "So Richard isn't just laundering money for his own real estate business," she said. "No. He's a node in someone else's operation." "Yes. And Carver, Thomas Carver," Vincent said carefully, "is a man that certain federal agencies have been trying to build a case against for 11 years. He is extremely careful. He uses multiple layers of operators and never has direct contact with the money. He is, by any reasonable measure, untouchable through conventional investigation." He looked at her. Unless someone walks into the U.S. Attorney's Office with documentation of the domestic layer of his operation, which would give them a thread to pull, a thread that leads from the Crawford Sterling shells through the intermediate entities to Meridian and from Meridian to Carver. She understood. That's what we handed them this morning, she said. Yes. We didn't know it, but we handed the U.S. Attorney's Office a thread that leads to Thomas Carver. Yes, she breathed carefully. And Carver knows. Richard told him. Vincent's voice was very flat. Which means Carver is no longer quiet, which means the next move is not going to come from Richard's attorneys or from the FBI or from anyone operating within a legal framework. The kitchen was completely still. She said, "He'll try to destroy the documentation. The documentation is already in federal hands. You can't unsubmit something to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Then he'll try to destroy the credibility of whoever submitted it." She looked at Vincent. "You?" He said nothing. "Vincent, he's going to come after you. He's going to try." His voice had the quality of a man who has had this conversation with himself many times and arrived at the same place every time. "Carver has tried before. I'm still here. This is different. This time there's a federal investigation and your documentation is inside it. And if Carver can demonstrate that you obtained those records through illegitimate means, or that your organization has interests that compromise the submission, the entire evidentiary package becomes questionable." She was thinking out loud and she knew it, and she kept going anyway. "He doesn't have to destroy you. He just has to make you complicated enough that the U.S. Attorney's Office distances themselves from your documentation." He's done. Vincent looked at her. "That's exactly right," he said. "So what do we do?" He was quiet for a moment. The coffee sat cooling between them. Outside, the city had gone dark early, the way it did in winter, the sky pressing down on the buildings. "There's something else," he said. His voice had changed, just slightly, a register lower, a fraction slower. The specific quality of a man choosing his words not for precision, but for impact management. She waited. "The reason I started watching Richard 18 months ago," Vincent said, "I told you it was because he was doing business with people who do business with me. That was true. But it wasn't the complete truth." She said, "Tell me the complete truth." He looked at her for a long moment. 18 months ago, I received information that Richard Sterling had been, for some time, providing financial intelligence to a contact with connections to an organized crime investigation. Information about the financial structures of various organizations operating in New York. He paused. "Including mine." The kitchen did not change. The light was the same. The temperature was the same. She said, "Richard was feeding information about your organization to someone building a case," Vincent said. "Yes, which is why I started watching him. I needed to understand how much he knew and who he was talking to and what he had given them." He looked at her steadily. "What I found when I started looking was that Richard's information about my organization was limited and largely incorrect. He didn't have access to anything substantive, but in the process of looking at him, I found the structure he had built under your name." She stood very still. "You started investigating Richard to protect yourself," she said. "Yes." "And you found what he had done to me." "Yes." "And then you were on West 72nd Street on the night of the blizzard." Silence. "Vincent," her voice was very quiet, "were you watching his building that night?" He held her gaze. He did not look away. He did not offer an excuse or a reframe or the particular verbal maneuver she had watched him use to deflect things for as long as she had known him. He said, "Yes." She absorbed that, the full dimensions of it, the 18 months, the file, the night he stepped out of the car in the snow with an expression she had read as pain, and that was pain. She did not doubt that, but was also something more complicated, something that had to do with surveillance and intelligence and the specific geometry of a man who had positioned himself adjacent to a situation he had been monitoring for a year and a half. She said, "You weren't there by accident." "No. You've known about Richard and me for 18 months. I've known about the financial structure for 18 months. I knew you were involved, as a victim, for most of that time." "And you didn't contact me." He said nothing. You had evidence that my identity was being used to construct a criminal enterprise, and you didn't contact me. Her voice was still quiet. It was the quiet of something that has gone past the point of raising itself. You watched for 18 months. I needed to understand the full scope before I... Don't. She said it without heat, just the single word. He stopped. Don't give me the strategic rationale. I understand the strategic rationale. I'm asking you why you didn't call me. The silence between them was the kind that had history in it, 11 years of it. He said, because I didn't know how. She looked at him. After 11 years, he said, I didn't know how to call you and say what I had found. I knew how to watch. I knew how to build a file. I knew how to position myself to be useful when the situation required it. He looked at the counter. I didn't know how to pick up the phone and say, the man you married built a trap around your identity, and I've been watching it for a year, and I'm sorry I left, and I'm sorry I didn't come back sooner, and I'm sorry it took a blizzard. She held very still. She held very still because the alternative was something she could not afford right now. Not with a federal investigation accelerating, not with Thomas Carver newly active, not with her sons in the next room and her life in pieces on the floor of a situation that was about to get significantly more dangerous. She said, we'll come back to this. I know. Right now I need to think about Carver. I know that too. She turned back to the counter. She picked up the cold coffee and drank it because she needed something to do, and because the alternative was standing in Vincent Moreau's kitchen, feeling the specific weight of 11 years rearranging itself into a shape she did not have time to examine. Her phone rang. Vasquez. She answered. The Meridian documentation your son found, Vasquez said without preamble. I ran it past a contact who works international financial crime. She recognized the structure immediately. A pause. Vivian, the U.S. Attorney's Office has been trying to build a Carver case for 8 years. If what your son found is what I think it is, we just handed them the domestic thread they've been missing. Another pause. Which means this is no longer a divorce case or a fraud case or even a money laundering case. Vivian said, what is it? It's a federal organized crime investigation, Vasquez said, and your name is at the center of the paper trail. She stopped. Then, and I just received a call from a blocked number, someone who identified themselves only as a representative of interested parties who wanted to convey that the documentation submitted to the U.S. Attorney's Office this morning would be in everyone's best interest to quietly withdraw. The coffee cup was cold in Vivian's hand. They threatened you, Vivian said. They were very polite about it, Vasquez said, which is somehow worse. A beat. Vivian, I need you to understand what we are now dealing with. This is not Richard and his attorney anymore. Richard has become the least dangerous person in this situation. What's behind Richard? What your son found in those transaction records. That is something. Vasquez finished the sentence the next morning. She finished it in person at 7:15, sitting across from Vivian at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she had not drunk, and her coat still on because she had come directly from her office where she had apparently not slept. Something you are not equipped to fight with the tools you currently have, she said. Vivian looked at her. Carver's representative called again at 4 this morning, Vasquez said. Different number, same politeness. This time they were specific. She set the cup down. They want the Meridian documentation, not just withdrawn from the federal proceeding, destroyed. Every copy, every derivative analysis, everything your son compiled, everything Vincent's team produced, everything we submitted yesterday morning. That's not possible, Vivian said. It's in federal hands. They know that. They're not asking us to retrieve it from the U.S. Attorney's Office. They're asking us to publicly recant, to submit a correction stating that the documentation was produced through compromised methodology and cannot be relied upon. Vasquez looked at her steadily. If we recant, the federal team loses their evidentiary foundation. The Meridian thread disappears. Carver's domestic operation stays invisible. Richard takes whatever reduced exposure remains, and the whole structure goes back underground. Vivian said, and if we don't recant? Vasquez was quiet for exactly long enough to tell her the answer was not simple. They have something, Vivian said. They have Ethan. The kitchen did not move. The light did not change. Vivian's hands on the table in front of her did not move either, and the stillness of them was the most effortful thing she had ever produced in her life. "Explain," she said. Her voice came out level. She did not know how. "Ethan left the building yesterday afternoon," Vasquez said. "Around 3. Eleanor thought he was going to the park. He was gone for 2 hours. When he came back, he didn't mention it." She paused. "Carver's representative sent a photograph this morning. Ethan, on a street in the West Village. Timestamp, yesterday, 3:14. He's alone. He looks fine." She looked at Vivian. The message attached said, "He was easy to find. He'll be easy to find again." Vivian breathed in. She breathed out. She stood up. She walked to the window and stood with her back to the room and looked at the park below and breathed very carefully through her nose and counted the seconds between each breath because the alternative was something that would not help her son. Behind her, she heard Vincent come into the kitchen. Vasquez said, "Vincent, they have a photograph of Ethan." Vincent said nothing for a moment. Then, "When?" "Yesterday afternoon, West Village. He left without telling anyone." His voice was controlled. She could hear it being controlled. "Yes." She heard him pull out a chair. She heard him sit. She did not turn around. "Vivian," he said. She turned around. He was looking at her with an expression that was stripped of every layer she had ever seen him maintain over 30 years of knowing him in various configurations. There was nothing professional in it, nothing strategic. It was the face of a man who had just understood that a situation had reached the part where everything he knew how to do might not be enough. "I'm going to get him," she said. It came out very quiet and very final. "He's here," Vincent said. "He came home. He's in his room." She moved past both of them and down the corridor and opened Ethan's door without knocking. He was awake. He was sitting on the bed in yesterday's clothes, and he had clearly not slept, and he looked up when she came in with the expression of someone who has been waiting for an arrival they knew was coming. She sat on the edge of the bed. She looked at him. "Where did you go?" she said. "I needed to think." "Ethan, I know." He looked at his hands. "I went to look at our building, Dad's building, the Ashford. He stopped. "I wanted to see it. I don't know why. I just needed to see it and know it was real. That all of this was real and not just something happening in someone else's apartment." She put her hand on the back of his neck. He was 14 years old and he was carrying something that no 14-year-old should have to carry, and he had gone to look at the building his father had thrown them out of because he needed proof that reality was structured the way he thought it was. She understood that completely. "Someone followed you," she said. He went still. "They sent a photograph, a message. They want us to withdraw the documentation or—" She stopped. She looked at her son. She decided he was owed the truth. "Or they'll hurt you." He looked at her. His jaw did something. He was 14 and he had his father's jaw in her eyes, and he set them both in a way that she recognized as something neither of them had given him. "We're not withdrawing," he said. "No," she said. "We're not." "Then what?" She looked at him for a moment. "Then we finish it," she said. "Faster than they expect." She went back to the kitchen. Vincent and Vasquez were both on their phones. She stood in the doorway until they both finished. She said, "What's the fastest path to indictment?" Vasquez said, "We need to give the U.S. Attorney's Office the Meridian beneficial ownership documentation." The Cayman layer. If we can pierce the nominee structure and identify Carver as the beneficial owner of Meridian directly, they have enough to move on him immediately, not in weeks, days. Can we pierce it? Through legitimate channels, it would take months. The Cayman Registry doesn't cooperate with voluntary disclosure requests. It requires a formal MLAT request through the Department of Justice International Division, and "Vincent," Vivian said. He looked at her. "Can you pierce the Meridian structure?" she said. He was quiet. "I know what I'm asking," she said. "I know what it means for you to use those channels in a way that's going to be visible to people you don't want it to be visible to. I know the exposure." She looked at him steadily. "Can you do it?" He said, "I can have the Meridian beneficial ownership in 4 hours." "Then do it." He picked up his phone and left the kitchen. Vasquez looked at Vivian. "If he obtains that through extra-legal means, he'll have it packaged in a way that's producible," Vivian said. "He's done this before. Let him work." She went to find Landon. Landon was in his room, already awake, already at his laptop. He looked up when she came in, and she could see from his face that he had heard enough to understand the shape of the morning. "The auction," she said. He looked at her. "The Ashford residences. Richard is going to need to liquidate assets when the indictment comes. The building is his most valuable holding. He'll have to auction it." She sat down. "I need to know the timeline. When is the earliest a court-ordered asset liquidation could happen once an indictment is filed?" Landon was already typing. "Voluntary sale before indictment is faster," he said. "If Richard's attorney advises him to liquidate voluntarily to demonstrate cooperation and reduce forfeiture exposure, he could put the building up for auction within 30 days. He'll do that," Vivian said. "Marcus Hale will tell him it's his best remaining option. Control the sale rather than have it seized." She looked at the screen. "I need to know how much the building will go for at a compressed auction timeline. Estimated value is $240 million based on the last independent appraisal," Landon said. He pulled up a property database. Compressed auction, motivated seller, 60-day timeline, probably moves at 15 to 20% under market. Call it 200 even. "And what would be required to participate in the auction as a qualified bidder?" He looked at her. He was 14 years old, and he was faster than most adults she had worked with, and he had arrived at the destination before she got there. "Proof of financial capacity for the deposit, 10%, 20 million. She said, "Find out if Vincent's legal investment company has that capacity in liquid trust structures." "I already know it does," Landon said. "I looked at their public filings last night." She stared at her son. "What?" he said. "I was bored." She was quiet for a moment. "I need you to find out," she said carefully, "whether there is a mechanism through which a trust structure could register as a qualified auction bidder under a name other than Moreau Capital." Landon's fingers had already stopped. He was very still. "A name like Crawford," he said. She said nothing. He turned back to his laptop. His hands moved with the specific focus speed she recognized as his highest operational mode, the one he entered when a problem had clicked into a shape that he could work with. "Delaware trust structure," he said, half to himself. "Registered beneficiaries can be minors if there's a designated trustee. Bidding authority can vest in the trust itself rather than individual trustees." He typed. He read. He typed again. "A trust called Crawford Brothers Holdings," he said quietly, "with Ethan and me as beneficiaries and Vincent's legal division as trustee. It could register as a qualified bidder if the trust can demonstrate capital access." He looked at her. "Which it can, if Vincent's company capitalizes it." The room was very quiet. "Mom," he said, "are you doing what I think you're doing?" She said, "I'm doing what needs to be done." He looked at her for a long moment with the steady, serious eyes that had always made him seem older than his years, and then he turned back to his laptop and started building the structure. At 11:40, Vincent's phone produced a result. He came into the kitchen where Vivian and Vasquez were working, and he set a single printed page on the table between them. On it was a corporate structure diagram, clean, precise, 3 layers deep, with a name at the top that neither of them had seen in any of the documentation so far. Thomas Carver, beneficial owner. Meridian Property Trust. Below it, a chain of nominee directors, registered agents, and intermediary entities, each one annotated with the document reference from which it had been identified. Vasquez looked at it for a long time. She picked it up. She read it carefully. She set it back down. "This is enough," she said. "Call Park," Vivian said. Vasquez was already dialing. The call lasted 9 minutes. Vasquez spoke and listened and spoke again, and when she ended it, she sat for a moment with the phone in her hand and the expression of someone assembling the implications of what she had just been told. "They're moving on Carver today," she said. "International coordination. DOJ contacted their counterparts in the UK and Cayman this morning. Apparently they've had an open file on Carver for 8 years, and what we gave them completes it. The domestic indictment against Richard will be filed simultaneously." But she looked at Vivian. "Park also said—" She stopped. "Organize something. Park said to tell you that the preliminary target designation on your name has been formally removed from their case file and replaced with a material witness classification. Vivian sat down. She had not realized until that moment that she had been standing for the entire morning. She sat down and put both hands flat on the table and breathed through her throat, which still ached every time she breathed deeply. And she did not say anything for a long moment. "It's not over," Vasquez said. "The documentation still needs to—" "I know," Vivian said. "I know it's not over." She looked up. "But I'm not on the target list anymore." "No," Vasquez said. "You're not." Vincent was standing near the window. He was looking at her with an expression she did not have a name for, something that had relief in it, and something that had the quality of a man watching a conclusion arrive that he had been working toward for a long time without being able to say out loud that he was working toward it. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She looked at it. Vasquez and Vincent both looked at it. She answered. "Ms. Crawford." The same voice from this morning. Carver's representative, the polite one with the carefully maintained neutrality of a man delivering messages he had not written. "I understand there have been some developments this morning." "Yes," she said. "Our principals would like to revisit the terms of—" "No," she said. A pause. "Ms. Crawford, I want to make sure you understand the—" "I understand everything," she said. "Your principals are being indicted in 3 jurisdictions simultaneously. The documentation is in federal hands and has been corroborated by an independent 8-year investigation. There is nothing left to revisit." She paused. "Don't call this number again." She ended the call. The kitchen was silent. Then Ethan appeared in the doorway. He had changed his clothes. He had his mother's precision and his own particular version of composure, the kind that had been built under pressure and showed it in the way a scar shows, not ugly but present. He looked at the page on the table. He looked at his mother. He looked at Vincent. "It's done?" he said. "Almost," Vivian said. "What's left?" She looked at him. "Richard?" Ethan nodded slowly. "He still has the building. For now." He understood. She could see him working through it, the same way she had worked through it that morning. The auction, the timeline, the trust structure his brother was already building on a laptop in the next room. He arrived at the destination. "Crawford Brothers Holdings," he said. She looked at him. "Landon told you." "Landon tells me everything, eventually." He looked at the table. "He's been working on the filing structure for 2 hours." He looked up. "Are you sure? It's—" He stopped. "It's a lot." "It's exactly right," she said. Something settled in his face, the particular quality of a person who has been carrying an unnamed weight and has just been told they can set it down somewhere that matters. He said, "Okay." And then Landon appeared behind him in the doorway, laptop in hand, and said, "Crawford Brothers Holdings Delaware Trust is registered and has a EIN. I need Vincent's legal team to sign the capitalization documents, and we can submit the qualified bidder registration before the auction house closes today." Vincent looked at Vivian. She looked back. "Do it," he said. To Landon, but looking at her. Landon disappeared. Ethan followed him. The kitchen was quiet again. Outside the window, the afternoon light was doing something complicated with the snow still left on the park below, turning it from white to a particular shade of pale gold that would only last about 20 minutes before the sun dropped behind the buildings on the west side and took it with it. Richard called at 3:40. He called Vivian's cell directly. She looked at the number and then she answered it because she was done not answering things. "I know what you did," he said. His voice was different from what she expected. Not controlled, not managed. It had lost the particular architecture of performance that had characterized every conversation she'd had with him for 14 years. What was underneath it was smaller and more frightened, and she could hear that he was somewhere without enough distance from himself to hide it. "Which part?" she said. "The U.S. Attorney's Office, Moreau's files, the Cayman documentation." A pause. "Vivian, this is going to destroy everything." "Yes." "I have nothing left. Do you understand that? Marcus says the building is going to be seized if I don't sell it voluntarily. Everything I've built for— Richard," her voice was level. "You built it on my name, on my signature, on my professional reputation, and my published methodology and my 14 years of documented work. You built it on me." She paused. "What you're losing is what you took." A long silence. He stopped. The boys. I want to talk to Ethan and Landon. She thought about this for exactly 3 seconds. When this is over, she said, that's between you and them. I won't prevent it. But right now they're working. Working. Yes. Another silence. What are they working on? She said, the auction. He was very quiet for a long time after that. She could hear his breathing. She could hear him understanding. You're going to buy it, he said. You're going to buy the Ashford. She said nothing. Vivian, you can't possibly have the capital to... He stopped. The understanding completed itself in his silence. Moreau. A trust, she said. A legal trust with appropriate beneficiaries and proper capitalization. That's my building. It was your building, she said. You're going to sell it in the next 30 days to avoid having it seized, and when you sell it, we're going to be the winning bid. I can reject bids, You can reject bids until your attorney tells you that the highest qualified offer is the one you take, she said. Because taking it demonstrates voluntary cooperation. Because taking it is the difference between a sentence Marcus can work with and one he can't. She paused. He'll tell you to take it, Richard. You know he will. The silence on the other end of the line had a quality she had never heard from Richard before. It was not calculation. It was not management. It was the silence of a man who has run out of moves and knows it, and is sitting alone in a hotel room discovering what that actually feels like from the inside. She said, you should call your sons. Not now, but when this is over. She said it without cruelty. She said it because she meant it, and because whatever Richard Sterling had done to her, Ethan and Landon were still his sons, and they would have to find a way to hold that, eventually, and it would be easier if he gave them something to work with. Give them that much. She ended the call. She set the phone on the table. Vincent was still in the kitchen. He had not left. He had been there through the whole call, near the window, not listening in the sense of leaning in, but simply present the way he had been present since the night of the blizzard. Within reach, quiet, not asking for anything. She looked at him. She said, the auction is in 4 weeks. I know. Crawford Brothers Holdings is going to win it. I know that too. After that, she stopped, organized what she was going to say. After that, I want to talk about the 11 years, and the 18 months, and what you said last night about not knowing how to call. He looked at her steadily. I'll be here, he said. I know, she said. She picked up her laptop. She had work to do. Down the hall, Landon was filing documents, and Ethan was cross-referencing auction regulations. And outside the window, the gold was fading off the snow exactly the way she had predicted. The light going flat, and then blue, and then dark, and the auction was set for a Thursday, 26 days after the federal indictment landed on Richard Sterling's desk in the Four Seasons suite where he had been living since the night he put his family in the snow. 26 days during which Marcus Hale had done everything a 60-year-old attorney with 4 decades of experience could do for a client who had systematically eliminated every available option, and the sum of everything he could do turned out to be take the voluntary sale, demonstrate cooperation, and hope that the judge assigned to the case had somewhere in their history an experience of mercy. Vivian knew the morning of the auction the way she had known other mornings that mattered. Not through anticipation, but through the specific quality of her own body, when something that had been building for a long time was about to arrive. She woke at 5. She lay in the dark of the room that had been hers for 4 weeks now, and she listened to the building around her. The particular silence of a well-constructed high-rise at that hour, not empty, but held, the way a breath is held before a word. She dressed carefully. Dark suit, the one she had bought 3 weeks ago because she had nothing left from before and had decided that everything going forward should be chosen rather than carried over. She stood in front of the mirror and looked at the woman looking back at her and did not perform anything for her own reflection. The surgical scar at the base of her throat had faded to the pale, thin line it would remain. Her voice had returned fully 6 days ago. The surgeon had confirmed it at the follow-up, pronounced the healing complete, and she had said thank you in the full register of her own voice for the first time in weeks, and had felt something release in her chest that she had not known she was holding. She went to the kitchen. Eleanor had coffee made. She had learned over 4 weeks that Eleanor always had coffee made. that Eleanor operated on a schedule calibrated to the household rather than to any clock, and that this was one of the small, reliable facts of life in this apartment that she had come to depend on without meaning to. Ethan and Landon were already at the table. Ethan in a jacket he had bought himself, dark blue, that he had pressed the night before with the iron Eleanor had shown him where to find. Landon in what appeared to be the same clothes he'd worn for 3 days, which was Landon's consistent position on formality, offset by the fact that he had combed his hair, which for him constituted dressing up. They looked at her when she came in. She looked at them. Nobody said anything for a moment, which was its own kind of conversation. Then Landon said, "The qualified bidder confirmation came through at midnight. We're registered. Deposit is held in escrow by the auction house." "I know," she said. "I got the email. I also ran projections on the competing bidders. There are 4 other registered parties. 2 are investment funds that typically bid conservatively on distressed assets. They'll cap out around 180. One is a foreign real estate group that has a pattern of withdrawing at the first significant counter. One is—" he paused. "One is a shell entity I can't fully identify. Registered in the last 10 days. Delaware, nominee director." She looked at him. "I know," he said. "I flagged it to Vasquez last night. She's looking at it." Ethan said, "It's Dad." The kitchen was quiet. "He can't bid on his own asset at a court-monitored voluntary sale," Vivian said. "It's not him directly," Ethan said. He was looking at his coffee. "But I think it's someone he called. Someone who might take the building and hold it in a way that—" He stopped. "Marcus told him to cooperate. He's cooperating. But cooperating doesn't mean he's not trying to control where it lands." She thought about Richard. She thought about the specific character of his resistance. Not frontal, never frontal, always lateral, always through structures and entities and arrangements that preserve the appearance of compliance while protecting the substance of control. She thought, even now, she said, "It doesn't matter. We outbid whoever they send." Landon said, "To a point. The trust capitalization has a ceiling." "I know the ceiling," she said. "We won't hit it." She looked at both of them. "Richard is out of money. His assets are frozen pending forfeiture proceedings. Whatever he's trying to do through that shell, he doesn't have enough left to sustain it past the first 3 rounds of bidding. He's bluffing with someone else's chips." Ethan looked at her with the careful eyes. "You've been thinking about this." "For 3 weeks," she said. She drank her coffee. The city outside was still dark at that hour, the park below holding its last winter cold, the sky just beginning at its easternmost edge to suggest the idea of morning without yet committing to it. Vincent came in at 5:40. He had been at his downtown office since 2 in the morning. She knew because she had heard him leave, had been awake at that hour, had lain in her room listening to the elevator and understanding that he was doing whatever he did in the small hours before something large happened. He came in now with his coat still on and the particular quality of stillness he carried when he had been working for a long time and had converted all available energy into focus. He looked at the 3 of them at the table. He said, "The shell bidder. Vasquez identified the beneficial owner an hour ago." Vivian waited. "It's not Richard," he said. "It's a former business associate of Richard's, a man named Paulson who runs a property management company in the outer boroughs. Richard called him 11 days ago and apparently offered him a finder's fee arrangement if the building could be acquired and held in a structure that would allow Richard eventual access." He looked at Vivian. "He has limited capital. He'll be competitive to about 190, 195 based on what Vasquez could find about his liquidity." "We go to 210 if we have to," Vivian said. "We can go to 220, Vincent said, but the trust has room." She looked at him. "Thank you." He nodded once. He poured himself coffee. He sat at the end of the table, and for a few minutes the 4 of them sat together in the kitchen of his apartment, with the city going from dark to gray outside and nobody saying anything. And it was the most ordinary moment that had happened in 4 weeks. And it had a weight to it because of that. Because ordinary was not something any of them had been able to reach for a long time. The auction was held in a large conference facility on Park Avenue at 10 o'clock. The room had the atmosphere of these events, expensive chairs, institutional lighting, the particular air of controlled tension that came from money preparing to move. There were perhaps 40 people in the room, attorneys, representatives, the 4 other registered bidder parties, each accompanied by counsel, and along one wall, 3 court officers present to ensure the proceedings met the legal requirements of a monitored voluntary sale. Vivian sat with Vasquez on her left and the two boys behind her. Vincent was not in the room. He had not come. She had not asked him to. She had thought about this the night before, about what it would mean for him to be visible at this auction, about the specific message it would send to Richard's people, to anyone watching, to the court officers along the wall. If Vincent Moreau was seated beside the representative of Crawford Brothers Holdings when the gavel came down. She had thought about it, and she had thought about him, and she had knocked on his office door at 11 the night before and told him she thought it was better if he wasn't there. He had looked at her for a moment. "I know," he had said. "I just wanted to see if you'd ask me to stay away or let me decide." "I'm asking," she said. "Good," he said. "That means you trust me to go." She had looked at him in his office doorway with 11 years of history and 4 weeks of something new, and she had said, "I trust you." He had nodded. He had gone back to his desk. She had stood in his doorway for another moment before she went back to her room, because the specific truth of what she had just said was still finding its dimensions, still settling into the shape of something she could hold. The auction opened at 9:45. The opening bid was set at $160 million. Vivian did not bid in the first round. She sat with her paddle in her lap, and she watched the room, and she listened to Vasquez's occasional murmur, and she let the first 3 rounds establish the field. The 2 conservative investment funds topped out at 182. The foreign real estate group bid to 178 and withdrew. That left Paulson's entity and Crawford Brothers Holdings. Paulson's representative, a man in his 50s in a gray suit who bid with the slightly over-deliberate manner of someone who had been told to look confident, went to 190. Vivian raised her paddle. 195. Paulson's representative conferred briefly with the attorney beside him, went to 198. Vivian raised her paddle again. $205 million. The room had gone quiet in the way rooms go quiet when they understand that what's happening is no longer procedural. Paulson's representative conferred again. Longer this time. She watched him, and she watched the attorney, and she watched the specific quality of the exchange between them, which had the texture of a conversation about limits being reached. She had seen Richard's financial exposure. She knew what Paulson had. She had done the math 3 weeks ago. He bid 210. She raised her paddle before the echo of the announcement finished. 215. Paulson's representative looked at the number on the board. He looked at his attorney. His attorney shook his head. Once, slight, final. The room was very still. The auctioneer said, $215 million. Going once. Vivian looked at the surface of the table in front of her. She thought about a lobby. She thought about a night concierge named Gerald who had looked away. She thought about 2 boys in their coats and a woman with surgical tape on her throat and 18 inches of snow and a door that had been locked behind her. Going twice. She looked up. She looked at the court officers along the wall, and she looked at Vasquez beside her, and she looked briefly at the boys behind her. Ethan with his hands in his lap and his jaw set, and Landon with his legal pad already open because Landon documented everything out of an instinct so deep it had stopped being a decision. Sold, the auctioneer said, to Crawford Brothers Holdings. The room released its held breath. Vasquez put her hand briefly on Vivian's arm. Didn't say anything, didn't need to. Ethan leaned forward and put his hand on his mother's shoulder from behind, and she covered it with her own hand, and they stayed like that for a moment while the room around them began the organized murmur of a proceeding that had concluded. Landon wrote something on his legal pad. She looked at it. It said, "We own a building." He had underlined it twice, which was as close as Landon came to exclamation points. The paperwork took 3 hours. She signed 14 documents in the conference room off the main hall, and each time she wrote her signature, she watched the terminal stroke of the sea lift, right the way it always had, the way it had for 40 years, the way no forger had ever quite managed to replicate. She was in the car heading back uptown when Richard called. She had expected the call. She had been waiting for it since the gavel came down. She answered. He said, "It's done." "Yes," she said. A silence. "Paulson called me." He said. Richard stopped. She could hear in his voice the particular quality of a man who has been managing his own emotional state for hours and is losing ground. "He said you went to 215. "Yes." That's above market for the current. I know what it is, she said. Another silence. Longer. She watched the park slide past the window. He said, I'm going to trial in 40 days. I know. Marcus says... He stopped again. Marcus says the cooperation credit will help, but the exposure on the Carver connection it's significant. The DOJ is treating it as organized crime facilitation. The sentencing guidelines for that... He did not finish the sentence. She said nothing. She let the silence do what it was going to do. He said, I want you to know that I... He stopped, started again. I want you to know that I understand what I did. Not the way I understood it when I told you in the bedroom. That night I was managing a situation. I was telling you what was necessary for the outcome I needed. He breathed. I understand now what I actually did. To you. To the boys. Another breath. I don't expect... I'm not asking for... I don't know what I'm asking for. She looked out the window at the park, at the last of the winter snow still holding in the shadows under the tree line, the places the sun had not yet reached. She said, You should call Ethan and Landon when they're ready. I don't know when that is. That's for them to tell you, but you should ask. Will they? I don't know, she said honestly. That's not mine to answer. He was quiet for a long time. She said, Richard, the night you put us out in the snow, you said it wasn't a mistake. You said it was a choice. She paused. I've thought about that a lot, about what it means that you were right. He said, Vivian, it was a choice, she said, and so is everything that comes after it, for both of us. She let that sit for a moment. I hope yours get better. She ended the call. She sat in the car for the rest of the drive with her phone in her lap and her hands still and the city moving past her in its afternoon state, busy and indifferent and alive in the way that cities are alive, without caring about any specific life within them, which she had once found lonely and now found, in some way she could not fully articulate, freeing. Vincent was at the penthouse when she arrived. He was in the kitchen with 2 cups, and he looked up when she came in, and she could see in his face that he already knew. Eleanor had told him, or Vasquez had called, or he had simply waited for the time it would take and calculated the result. She sat down across from him. She said, 2:15. I heard, he said. Landon texted me. He included a spreadsheet. She almost laughed. It surprised her. The laugh. The almost of it. The fact that something in her chest had enough room for it. I need to tell you something, she said. He looked at her. I'm going to take the position at your investment company, she said. Director of Financial Investigations. But I need it to be mine. Not a favor, not a shelter. She looked at him steadily. I need to be there because I'm the right person for the work, and because the work matters. Not because you opened a car door in a blizzard. It's yours, he said. It was always going to be yours. I have 7 financial analysts, and not one of them would have looked at Richard's structure and identified the inverted methodology in 20 minutes. I identified it in 4, she said. He looked at her. That thing happened in his face again. The thing that had been happening since West 72nd Street. The thing that was not quite a smile, but was something older and more serious than a smile. 4, he said. I stand corrected. She put both hands around her cup. And the other thing, she said. He was very still. The 11 years, she said. I've been thinking about what you said, about not knowing how to call, about driving past that building. She looked at her cup. I'm not going to pretend that those things don't mean what they mean, that you spent 11 years within range and didn't close the distance. She looked up. But I've also spent 4 weeks watching you hold a door open without walking through it. And I think I understand the difference between a man who stays away because he doesn't care and a man who stays away because he doesn't know what he's worth to someone. He said nothing. His jaw did something small. I'm not forgiving the 11 years, she said. I'm not doing that, but I'm also not... She stopped, found the right words. I'm not building a wall out of them. I've had enough walls built around me by someone else. I don't need to build my own. Vincent looked at her for a long time. The afternoon light was doing the thing it had done on the auction morning, going from flat to golden in the hours before it dropped behind the buildings. And it was on the table between them and on his hands and on his face, and she thought that light was extraordinary and indifferent and did not care what happened under it, which was what she liked about it. He said, "I would like to try." She said, "I know." She said, "So would I." The renovation of the Ashford residences took 4 months. Crawford Brothers Holdings brought in a project manager, a design firm, and a property management company that had no prior connection to Richard Sterling's network. Landon managed the contractor relationships with a precision that made the project manager comment to Vivian, 3 weeks in, that her son was either going to be a real estate developer or a general, and Vivian had said he was probably going to be both. Ethan took a different interest. He spent 2 weeks reviewing the lease agreements for every commercial tenant in the building, an exercise that began as due diligence and became something more when he identified 3 tenants who had been paying below market rent in exchange for referrals to Richard's acquisition network. He brought the analysis to Vivian with the same careful presentation he had used for everything, and they restructured the commercial portfolio together over a weekend. And by the end of it, she understood that her older son was going to work in whatever field he chose and be exceptional at it. She told him that directly. He said, "I know." Then after a pause, "Landon's better at the numbers." She said, "Landon's better at finding things. You're better at knowing what to do with them." He thought about that for a while and seemed to find it accurate. She called the building Crawford Tower. The boys had suggested it, and she had said it was too much, and they had said it was exactly right. And Vasquez, when consulted, had said, "You bought it with a trust called Crawford Brothers Holdings. The name is already on the deed. You might as well put it on the front of the building." Eleanor, when she heard, had said nothing but had made the particular expression she made when she approved of something and didn't intend to say so. Richard's trial lasted 11 days. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. The verdict was not a surprise to anyone who had read the indictment, and the indictment had been thorough in the way that federal indictments are thorough when they have 18 months of private forensic work and 8 years of federal investigation to draw from. The sentence was announced on a Tuesday in a courtroom Vivian did not attend. She heard the number from Vasquez, who called immediately. She sat with it for a moment, and then she put the phone down and she thought about the specific quality of that number, what it meant in years, what it contained, what it did not. She did not celebrate. She had not expected to want to celebrate, and she didn't. What she felt was something quieter and more complicated. The particular exhaustion of a long effort concluded, and underneath it something she had not anticipated, which was a thin thread of grief. Not for Richard, for the version of her life she had believed she was living for 14 years, which had been real to her even if it was built on something false, and which was now definitively over in a way that could not be reopened. She grieved it for about an afternoon. She let herself sit in her office, her actual office now, at Moreau Capital's legal division on the 22nd floor of a building in Midtown, with her name on the door and her credentials on the wall, and a team of 7 people who had come to her first week with the specific alert attention of analysts who could tell they were being managed by someone who knew the material. And she let herself feel the grief for the afternoon, and then she let it be done. Ethan called his father for the first time 6 weeks after the sentencing. Landon waited another 3 weeks and then called on a Sunday. Vivian knew because they told her afterward. She did not ask what was said. Both boys looked, after those calls, like people who had put something down that they had been carrying at an angle for a long time. Not resolved, not finished, but set somewhere that made it possible to move without it throwing them off balance. She asked Ethan once, not about the call itself, but about how he was. He said, "I think I'm going to be better than okay. I don't know when, but I think so." She said, "That's exactly the right answer." The grand opening of Crawford Tower was held on a Saturday in early spring, when the last of the winter had finally released its hold on the city and the park across the street was doing what Central Park did in that first week of warmth, going from gray to green in what felt like a single day, as if it had been waiting all along and had simply needed permission. The lobby had been redesigned. Not dramatically. She had resisted the impulse to erase everything, because erasure was its own kind of dishonesty, and she had decided she was done with structures that required concealment. The bones of the building were the same, the proportions were the same. What was different was the light. The renovation had opened 3 windows that Richard's redesign had closed 15 years ago, and the afternoon light now came through the lobby in a way that made the space feel inhabited rather than managed. Gerald was still at the front desk. She had kept him. He had looked at her when she offered him the position under the new management with an expression that contained everything he had not said on the night she walked out through his lobby in the snow. She had said, "I know." He had said, "Mrs. Crawford." "Ms. Crawford," she said. "Or Vivian." "Either." He had nodded. He had stayed. The opening was not large. She had resisted the pressure from the building's PR firm to make it an event. She did not want photographers, did not want coverage, did not want the story of Richard Sterling's fall and Vivian Crawford's rise packaged for consumption by people who had not earned the details. What she wanted was the building and the people in it, and the specific fact of standing in the lobby of a place that had tried to be the end of her story and was now, simply and irrevocably, the middle of a different one. She stood at the front of the lobby with Ethan on her left and Landon on her right, and she looked out at the 50 or so people who had gathered, residents, a few colleagues, Vasquez and her husband, Eleanor, who had come downtown in what appeared to be a new coat, and others who had some claim on this moment. She had written something. She had written it and rewritten it several times and in the end had reduced it to what it actually was. She said, "I was thrown out of this building in a snowstorm 4 months ago. I had my sons beside me and a surgical tape on my throat and no idea what was coming next." She paused. "What came next was harder than I expected and stranger than I expected and in some ways better than I had any reason to hope for." She looked at Ethan, at Landon. "My sons built the case that gave us this building. They did it in a single night, in a stranger's apartment, while I was on the phone with an attorney I'd never met. I want them to know that I see that I see both of them, clearly, and I'm proud of them in a way that doesn't have a word that's big enough." Ethan looked at the floor. Landon wrote something on the legal pad he had brought, because of course he had brought it. She looked back at the room. She said, "Strength isn't measured by how hard you fight back. It's measured by how many times you choose to stand after life knocks you down." She stopped. "That's not something I came up with. It's something I learned this winter from watching two boys who had every reason to collapse and didn't." She stopped there. She had written more, but it felt like more than the moment needed, and she had learned over 4 months of rebuilding to trust the feeling of enough. There was applause, not the loud kind, the kind that had meaning in it. Afterward, in the lobby, as people moved around and Gerald brought coffee from somewhere, and the spring light came through the newly reopened windows at an angle that hit the floor in a way she had not anticipated and was extraordinarily beautiful, Vincent came to stand beside her. He had been at the back of the room during the speech. She had seen him there. He had not moved to the front, had not positioned himself near her, had simply been present at the edge of the thing, which was, she had come to understand over 4 months, how he existed in the world. Not at the center of other people's moments, at the perimeter, facing inward. He stood beside her now, and they looked at the lobby together. He said, "You didn't mention me in the speech." "No?" she said. "I noticed that. I know you do." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that intentional?" "Yes," she said. "This story isn't about you. You opened a car door, that mattered. But what happened after it? That was us." She looked at him. "You didn't rescue me, Vincent. You gave me a warm room and a doctor and a set of files and enough space to do what I was always going to do if someone got out of my way and let me." He looked at her for a long time. "Okay," he said. She said, "I'm not diminishing what you did." "I know you're not." She said, "I'm going to need you to be okay with being the person who opened the door, not the person the story is about." He said, "I've spent 30 years being the person the story is about." He looked at the lobby, at the light coming through the windows, at Ethan across the room talking to Vasquez with the careful, engaged attention he brought to every conversation, and at Landon beside a window with his legal pad, documenting something. "I think," Vincent said slowly, "that being the person who opened the door might be the best thing I've ever done." She looked at him. He was not performing it. It was not the kind of thing Vincent Moreau performed. It was the specific quality of a man saying something true that had cost him something to arrive at. She said, "Then be that." He nodded. She looked back at the room, at the light, at her sons, at Gerald at his desk with the particular posture of a man who was exactly where he was supposed to be. At Vasquez laughing at something her husband had said. At the windows Richard had closed and she had opened. She thought about the night of the blizzard, about the surgical tape and the snow and the cold that had worked through her coat, and the particular quality of standing on a sidewalk with nowhere to go and two boys beside her. She thought about all the things that had been true in that moment that she did not know were true. The files, the forgeries, the Cayman structure, the 18 months, the 11 years. She thought about how much she had not known. She thought about how much she knew now. She breathed in, carefully through her fully healed throat, with the full capacity of her own voice restored and held ready, and she breathed out, and she looked at the light on the floor of a building that had her son's name on the deed, and she felt not happiness exactly, not the uncomplicated kind, but something more durable than happiness, something that did not depend on the absence of difficulty or the resolution of every grief, something that felt like ground beneath her feet. She had been looking for solid ground since the night Richard took it away from her, and she had found it in the last place she had expected, not in a rescue, not in a verdict, not in a gavel coming down on a winning bid, but here, in her own lobby, in her own name on the door, in the sound of her own voice saying what she meant. She stood in the light. She did not move for a while. Around her, the building lived the way buildings live when they are full of people who have chosen to be there, and the city continued outside the windows the way it always had and always would. Indifferent and vast and entirely capable of burying a person in 18 inches of snow, and then, given time, of thawing. She had been buried. She had thawed. The rest was hers, was